their ideas together. Well, first of all, when the exam starts, the examiner will introduce the recording because the exam is recorded. And then part one will consist of about 4 to 5 minutes of questions, all related in some way to personal circumstances of the candidate, nothing unfamiliar. So, for example, they might talk about where they live, or they might talk about their work or their studies. And then there'll be some more questions about other familiar things, you know, for example, television or going out, free time, common topics that people are familiar with talking about. The examiner throughout the test is assessing the fluency, coherence, pronunciation, etc. But in part one, they'll also have the idea that the candidate is on familiar territory. No final marks would be given at all. It would purely be the examiner getting a feel of how well they speak English. And often this is the stage where they get a feel of the pronunciation of the candidate, actually, because that's one of the first things you notice. So it's good for the candidates to show off their pronunciation, speak clearly from the very start. For part one of the test, the best thing for students to do to prepare for it is to practice talking about familiar topics, and so that they feel confident with talking about those things, and they feel that they do know the vocabulary, for example, that they're going to need to talk about those things. As far as pronunciation's concerned, it's good to be sure that you're confident of the pronunciation, or have checked that you pronounce the words that you would often use. So if you enjoy watching thriller movies, you can say thriller confidently and not suddenly think in the exam, how do I pronounce this? Also, be prepared to talk using a range of tenses. The examiner will probably ask you something about the past, the present, the future. So feel confident with a range of tenses, and generally just feel confident and relaxed with things that you probably know what to talk about anyway. You often talk about these things with people. In part two of the exam, the examiner will give the candidate a card with a task on it, and this is to talk for up to 2 minutes about a subject. The card will not just say talk about this, it will give some bullet points with particular aspects to talk about. The candidate will have 1 minute to prepare for this, and they can make notes. They'll be given a paper and pencil in the exam. They don't have to bring their own. And then they talk for 2 minutes as naturally as they can. In part two of the exam, the examiner is looking to hear a stretch of speech from the candidate, really, for 2 minutes. And the card and the bullet points are there to help, rather than you must fulfill all the bullet points. It's more that you can speak naturally about this subject, keep on topic, not go off topic, but develop and expand what you want to say for about 2 minutes. If students want to prepare for part two of the exam, it's good to be very familiar with what to do and to practice using exam practice material, for example, and making the notes, using all the bullet points. It's important to try and use all the bullet points so that you can be sure you won't dry up and you'll be able to talk for the full 2 minutes, and then be practiced in talking for a full 2 minutes so that you feel familiar with what that feels like. And then when you're actually speaking, try to use connecting words and expressions. Practice using things like that's why, this is because, and so but, connecting what you say and sequencing what you say. In part three of the exam, which lasts about 4 to 5 minutes, the candidate will be expected to answer questions on issues related to the topic that they talked about in part 2. The difference between part 2 and part 3 is that in part 2, for example, they'll have talked about something that's more personal, a personal experience, something like a meal they enjoyed. And then in part 3, that topic, a meal, would be developed in a more abstract way, giving their opinions, but not talking about their personal experiences on issues related to things connected with meals. So that could go to food, issues related to food, things like that, but more complex or more demanding sides of that topic. In part 3, the examiner is looking to see how well the candidate can answer more probing questions, more in-depth questions, where the candidate is not talking about familiar and personal experiences, but talking about more abstract, complex subjects. They're looking to see now if their fluency and coherence are maintained, or their range of grammar or vocabulary is maintained at this more demanding level. If students want to prepare for part 3, then it's important to practice answering questions that require you to give your opinion and to explain what you mean about things. Obviously, you can do plenty of practice for this using practice materials. And also to feel confident when doing this, not that it's something strange doing it in a foreign language. They need to practice using the language of comparing, contrasting, or explaining what they mean. And in my opinion, personally, I think, expressions like that. And that's really the main things that they can do. Also, another useful tip is perhaps to give themselves thinking time. So they get asked a difficult question and they have something to say like, let me think, or I haven't thought about that before, just to give themselves a short pause to get their ideas together. When candidates write their notes for part 2, it's entirely up to them how they do it, what language they write in. I mean, it's better to write them in English because you're thinking in English, but there's absolutely no penalty for how they write them. It's just what they choose to do. The examiner will normally give the candidate more time if they finish before the 2 minutes is up. If they stop talking, the examiner will leave some sort of pause and wait and see if they're going to say more. And only if they've completely dried up will they then move on to the follow-up questions. If candidates don't understand a question or want it to be repeated, it's absolutely fine to ask for clarification or ask for it to be repeated. Obviously, it's not a good idea to do this for every single question, but a couple of times during the exam is perfectly normal and natural. If a candidate can't understand a question at all, then it's probably best just to say, I'm sorry, I really don't understand the question. There's not much else you can do. Hopefully the examiner will rephrase it. In part 3, the examiner can rephrase questions. The paper that the candidates use for making notes for part 2, they have to hand back to the examiner after they've finished speaking, and this will just be destroyed. Nothing else will happen to it. The examiner won't read it or anything. If a candidate has strong negative feelings about a subject and expresses that, that's fine. You're not being assessed on your opinions, only on the quality of your English. If you get asked about something that you really don't know anything about or have any interest in, like, say, I don't know, popular television programs, and you never watch TV, then the best thing to do is explain why you never watch TV and say what you can say. If you know something, you probably know something about any subject, even if you don't have a big interest in it. Sometimes people aren't sure whether it's better to speak more and risk making mistakes, or to say little but make what they say very accurate. It's difficult. It's probably better to try for a happy medium, to be as accurate as you can, but to take a few risks and to show off what you can do. If a student wants to improve their band score by taking a course, so for example if they're band 5 and they want to get to band 7, how quickly they do that is not really dependent just on the teacher, the course book, but on their own work and how much they do to develop their English. If you're in an English-speaking environment, you've got many more opportunities to improve your English outside of class time, reading, talking to people, watching television. But you can still do that in a different environment, but it just requires a lot of effort on the part of the student rather than anyone else. The standard of the speaking exam is absolutely standard around the world. So the examiners receive the same training, the same standardization at the same intervals, and there should be no difference whatsoever wherever you take the exam in how it's assessed.